Above all else, I want to see things differently. Above all else, I want to see things differently. Above all else, I want to see things differently. Above all else, I want to see things differently. Above all else, I want to see things differently. Well, that's lesson 28 in A Course in Miracles workbook for students. We're reading from the Foundation for Inner Peace publication here on Sunday, January 28th of 2024. And it's a continuation of yesterday's lesson with specific applications. We're going to look around and tell ourselves, above all else, I want to see that tree differently, or whatever's in your field of vision. But before we get into that, let's take a look at our text reading. It's a little longer reading today. And we're ready for section 2 in chapter 4, The Illusions of the Ego. Section 2, The Ego and False Autonomy. We'll let Jesus do most of the talking. Let me just read to you. I'll say very little. It is reasonable to ask how the mind could ever have made the ego. In fact, it is the best question you could ask. There is, however, no point in giving an answer in terms of the past, because the past does not matter, and history would not exist if the same errors were not being repeated in the present. Abstract thought applies to knowledge because knowledge is completely impersonal, and examples are irrelevant to its understanding. Perception, however, is always specific, and therefore quite concrete. 2. Everyone makes an ego or a self for himself, which is subject to enormous variation because of its instability. He also makes an ego for everyone else he perceives, which is equally variable. Their interaction is a process that alters both, because they were not made by or with the unalterable, with a capital U. God, the unalterable. It is important to realize that this alteration can and does occur as readily when the interaction takes place in the mind as when it involves physical proximity. Thinking about another ego is as effective in changing relative perception as is physical interaction. There could be no better example that the ego is only an idea and not a fact. Your state of mind is a good example of how the ego was made. When you threw knowledge away, it is as if you never had it. This is so apparent that one need only recognize it to see that it does happen. This is so apparent that one need only recognize it to see that it does happen. If this occurs in the present, why is it surprising that it occurred in the past? Surprise is a reasonable response to the unfamiliar, though hardly to something that occurs with such persistence. But do not forget that the mind need not work that way, even though it does work that way now. We're learning a new way to think. Paragraph 4. Think of the love of animals for their offspring and the need they feel to protect them. That is because they regard them as part of themselves. No one dismisses something he considers part of himself. You react to your ego much as God does to his creations, with love, protection, and charity. Your reactions to the self you made are not surprising. In fact, they resemble in many ways how you will one day react to your real creations, which are as timeless as you are. The question is not how you respond to the ego, but what you believe you are. The question is not how you respond to the ego, but what you believe you are. Belief is an ego function, and as long as your origin is open to belief, you are regarding it from an ego viewpoint. When teaching is no longer necessary, you will merely know God. Belief that there is another way of perceiving is the loftiest idea of which ego thinking is capable. Belief that there is another way of perceiving is the loftiest idea of which ego thinking is capable. That is because it contains a hint of recognition that the ego is not the self, with a capital S for self, the Christ, the oneness with God self. Paragraph 5. Undermining the ego's thought system must be perceived as painful, even though it is anything but true. Undermining the ego's thought system must be perceived as painful, even though this is anything but true. Babies scream and rage if you take away a knife or scissors, although they may well harm themselves if you do not. In this sense, you are still a baby. We're just at the beginning. You have no sense of real self-preservation and are likely to decide that you need precisely what would hurt you most. Yet whether or not you recognize it now, you have agreed to cooperate in the effort to become both harmless and helpful, attributes that must go together. Your attitudes even toward this are necessarily conflicted, because all attitudes are ego-based. This will not last. Be patient a while and remember that the outcome is as certain as God. Paragraph 6. Only those who have a real and lasting sense of abundance can be truly charitable. This is obvious when you consider what is involved. To the ego, to give anything implies that you will have to do without it. To the ego, to give anything implies that you will have to do without it. When you associate giving with sacrifice, you give only because you believe that you are somehow getting something better and can therefore do without the thing you give. Giving to get is what that's called, giving to get, is an inescapable law of the ego, which always evaluates itself in relation to other egos. It is therefore continually preoccupied with the belief in scarcity that gave rise to it. The belief in scarcity that gave rise to the ego. Its whole perception of other egos as real is only an attempt to convince itself that it is real. Self-esteem in ego terms means nothing more than that the ego has deluded itself into accepting its reality and is therefore temporarily less predatory. This self-esteem, and it's in quotes, it's not really self-esteem, but it's ego self-esteem. This self-esteem is always vulnerable to stress, a term which refers to any perceived threat to the ego's existence. 7. The ego literally lives by comparisons. Equality is beyond its grasp and charity becomes impossible. The ego never gives out of abundance because it was made as a substitute for it. The ego was made for a substitute for abundance. That is why the concept of getting arose in the ego's thought system. Appetites are getting mechanisms, representing the ego's need to confirm itself. This is as true of body appetites as it is of the so-called higher ego needs. Both appetites are not physical in origin. The ego regards the body as its home and tries to satisfy itself through the body. But the idea that this is possible is a decision of the mind, which has become completely confused about what is really possible. Paragraph 8. The ego believes it is completely on its own, which is merely another way of describing how it thinks it originated. This is such a fearful state, to be on your own, to be alone, lonely. This is such a fearful state that it can only turn to other egos and try to unite with them in a feeble attempt at identification, or attack them in an equally feeble show of strength. It is not free, however, to open the premise to question, because the premise is its foundation. The ego is the mind's belief that it is completely on its own. The ego is the mind's belief that it is completely on its own, separate, apart from each other, apart from God. That's why we want to tell ourselves, above all else, I want to see things differently. We want to see our interconnectedness instead of seeing everything as separate. The ego is the mind's belief that it is completely on its own. The ego's ceaseless attempts to gain the spirit's acknowledgement and thus establish its own existence are useless. Spirit in its knowledge is unaware of the ego. It does not attack it. It merely cannot conceive of it at all. While the ego is equally unaware of spirit, it does perceive itself as being rejected by something greater than itself. This is why self-esteem in ego terms must be delusional. The creations of God do not create myths, although creative effort can be turned to mythology. It can do so, however, only under one condition. What it makes is then no longer creative. Myths are entirely perceptual, and so ambiguous in form and characteristically good and evil in nature that the most benevolent of them is not without fear connotations. 9. Myths and magic are closely associated, since myths are usually related to ego origins and magic to the powers the ego ascribes to itself. Mythological systems generally include some account of the creation and associate this with its particular form of magic. The so-called battle for survival is only the ego's struggle to preserve itself and its interpretation of its own beginning. This beginning is usually associated with physical birth, because it is hard to maintain that the ego existed before that point in time. The more religiously ego-oriented may believe that the soul existed before and will continue to exist after a temporary lapse into ego life. The more religiously ego-oriented may believe that the soul existed before and will continue to exist after a temporary lapse into ego life. Some even believe that the soul will be punished for this lapse. However, salvation does not apply to spirit, which is not in danger and does not need to be salvaged. Salvation is nothing, that paragraph 10, salvation is nothing more than right-mindedness, which is not the one-mindedness of the Holy Spirit, but which must be achieved before one-mindedness is restored. Right-mindedness leads to the next step automatically, because right perception is uniformly without attack, and therefore wrong-mindedness is obliterated. Remove all attack, and wrong-mindedness is obliterated. The ego cannot survive without judgment, and is laid aside accordingly. The mind then has only one direction in which it can move. Its direction is always automatic because it cannot but be dictated by the thought system to which it adheres. In the last paragraph, 11, it cannot be emphasized too often that correcting perception is merely a temporary expedient. It is necessary only because misperception is a block to knowledge, while accurate perception is a stepping stone towards it. The whole value of right perception lies in the inevitable realization that all perception is unnecessary. This removes the block entirely. Perception is unnecessary when we learn to follow guidance. You may ask how this is possible as long as you appear to be living in this world. That is a reasonable question. You must be careful, however, that you really understand it. Who is the, in quotes, you, however, who is the, in quotes, you who are living in this world? Spirit is immortal, and immortality is a constant state. It is as true now as it ever was or ever will be, because it implies no change at all. It is not a continuum, nor is it understood by being compared to an opposite. Knowledge never involves comparisons. That is its main difference between everything else the mind can grasp. Okay, and before we go back and look at our lesson, above all else, I want to see things differently. What's going on around the world? On holidays and observances, it says that it is Christa McAuliffe Day, Daisy Day, Global Community Engagement Day, International Lego Day, National Bible Sunday, National Blueberry Pancake Day, and I'm going to talk to you in a minute about blueberries, National Data Privacy Day, National Kazoo Day, National Pediatrician Day, Pop Art Day, Rattlesnake Roundup Day. And the main rattlesnake we have here in the Ozarks is the timber rattler, and it's the Cratalis horridus. There's also a pygmy rattler, but I've never seen one. Then there's the Rubber Ducky Day, and Thank a Plug-in Developer Day, and World Leprosy Day. And then of the vacciniums, your blueberries, that's your genus, there's the low bush. These are all the ones that are either native or naturalized in Missouri and Arkansas, Oklahoma, the Ozark area. It maybe even will extend out a little further. The Vaccinium pallidum is the low bush, and it's also called Vaccinium vacillans. And then there's the farkleberry blueberry, which is a Vaccinium arboreum. And then there's the deerberry, which is the Vaccinium steminium. And then there's the high bush swamp blueberry, which is the Vaccinium coriobosum. And then there's the Vaccinium ellioti, which is the Mayberry blueberry. Then there's the high bush blueberry, the Vaccinium fuscatum. And then in our continuing on with our figs, the Ficus carica out of Edible Landscaping, the brown turkey fig does well in large pots and fruits well in northern areas such as Long Island, New York. Very good against walls in northern areas, against the south wall. It's a good place to have it growing. If you're going to grow it in a pot, that's not as important because you'll protect it in the winter by bringing it into a greenhouse or a sunny window. Brown fruit with amber flesh, space 8 to 10 foot circles, zones 6 through 9. And in Permaculture for Beginners by Carrie Mitchell, she talks about how it's good to learn about your native plants and plant them very thick to attract, birds, because that for housing and for feeding your birds in your garden. Birds are very, very good. They bring fertilizer. They eat pests. And then one quick YouTube on Shaman Oaks YouTube. There is a woman dies, learns when we will have world peace, and it is sooner than you think. Dr. Linda Kramer is the woman who had the experience. So I would encourage you to listen. I'll put the link to that in the description below. Okay, well, let's take a look now at Lesson 28. Above all else, I want to see things differently. Today, we're really giving specific application to the idea for yesterday. In these practice periods, you will be making a series of definite commitments. The question of whether you will keep them in the future is not our concern. If you're willing at least to make them now, you have started on the way to keeping them. And we are still at the beginning. We're babies, huh? You may wonder, but think about how that as a child, as a baby, your parents take good care of you, make sure that nothing happens to you. And you can rest in that. Let go and let God. Let Jesus take care of your ego and your body so that you can give your mind to being cheerful. Isn't that what we learned yesterday, or was it the day before, just recently? I think it was yesterday. You may wonder why it is important to say, for example, above all else, I want to see this table differently. In itself, it is not important at all. Yet what is by itself? And what does in itself mean? You see a lot of separate things about you which really mean you are not seeing at all. You either see or not. When you have seen one thing differently, you will see all things differently. The light you will see in any one of them is the same light that you will see in all of them. When you say, above all else, I want to see this table differently, you are making a commitment to withdraw your preconceived ideas about the table and open your mind to what it is and what it is for. You're not defining it in past terms. You are asking what it is rather than telling it what it is. You're not binding its meaning to your tiny experience of tables, nor are you limiting its purpose to your little personal thoughts. You will not question what you've already defined. And the purpose of these exercises is to ask questions and to receive the answers. In saying, above all else, I want to see this table differently, you are committing yourself to seeing. It is not an exclusive commitment. It is a commitment that applies to the table just as much as to anything else, neither more nor less. You could in fact gain vision from just that table if you would withdraw all your own ideas from it and look upon it with a completely open mind. It has something to show you, something beautiful and clean and of infinite value, full of happiness and hope. Hidden under all your ideas about it is its real purpose, the purpose it shares with all the universe. In using the table as a subject for applying the idea for today, you are therefore really asking to see the purpose of the universe. You will be making the same request of each subject that you use in the practice period, and you're making a commitment to each of them to let its purpose be revealed to you, instead of placing your own judgment upon it. Do we need to read that again? Let's look at it, make sure you got it. In using the table as a subject for applying the idea for today, you are therefore really asking to see the purpose of the universe. You will be making the same request of each subject that you use in the practice period, and you're making a commitment to each of them to let its purpose be revealed to you, instead of placing your own judgment upon it. We will have 6 2-minute practice periods today in which the idea for the day is stated first, and then applied to whatever you see about you. Not only should the subjects be chosen randomly, but each one should be accorded equal sincerity as today's idea is applied to it, in an attempt to acknowledge the equal value of them all in their contribution to your seeing. As usual, the application should include the name of the subject your eyes happen to light on, and you should rest your eyes on it while saying, above all else, I want to see this, whatever it is, differently. Each application should be made quite slowly and as thoughtfully as possible. There is no hurry. And I think we have time to do one right now, so we'll take a couple minutes. And I'll hum whatever you, I'll just say, whatever, above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see things differently. Above all else, I want to see things differently. Now let's meditate, or let's do our little practice. As we look around, we'll say, above all else, I want to see this tree differently. I'll do a couple. Above all else, I want to see this wire differently. Above all else, I want to see that duck differently. Above all else, I want to see that leaf differently. Now you do it. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see things differently. Above all else, I want to see things differently. Above all else, I want to see things differently. And a word for peace in the Mohican language of the Hudson River, northeastern United States of America, is the Mohican word for peace is, and I don't know for sure if I'm pronouncing it properly, but Anachemowegan. 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 That probably sounds way off for a person that knows Mohican. But we're trying. Help us by learning. Send me a phonetic pronunciation. Above all else, I want to see things differently. Anachemowegan.